Ethan Walker slid the divorce papers across the marble table and smiled like a man doing his wife a favor. "Olivia, I need someone who belongs in my world now. You were fine when I was nobody, but I'm about to become somebody, and you'd only slow me down." He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He genuinely believed the quiet woman across from him was the dead weight holding back his billion-dollar future. He had no idea he was signing away a trillion-dollar queen. Before we go on, please subscribe to the channel and stay with this story all the way to the end. And do me a favor, comment the city you're watching from right now so I can see just how far this story travels. For 10 years, Ethan Walker believed one thing above all others. He believed that everything he had, every dollar, every headline, every handshake from a man in a $10,000 suit came from him and him alone. He believed it the way some men believe in God, without evidence, without doubt, and without ever once stopping to ask whether it was true. And on this particular night in the glass and steel house that overlooked the glittering skyline of downtown Austin, Texas, he was about to act on that belief in a way he could never take back. "Sit down, Olivia," he said. "We need to talk." Olivia Bennett set down the dish towel she'd been holding and walked into the room without a word. She was a small woman, plainly dressed, the kind of woman a stranger's eyes would slide right past in a crowded room. She wore no jewelry that night except a thin gold band on her left hand. Her hair was pulled back simply, and when she sat down across from her husband of 10 years, she folded her hands in her lap and waited the way she always waited, patient and calm, while Ethan gathered his thoughts. He didn't gather them long. "I've been thinking about us," he said, "about where I am now and where I'm going. And I think we both know things have changed." "Have they?" Olivia said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a woman who had watched this coming for a long time. Ethan reached into the leather folder beside him and took out a stack of papers. He laid them on the table between them and turned them so she could read the words printed across the top. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." He didn't slide them gently. He pushed them the way you'd push a bill across a counter. "I want a divorce," he said. For a moment, the only sound in that enormous house was the low hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Olivia looked at the papers, then she looked up at him. "Just like that," she said quietly. "Don't make this dramatic, Olivia, please. I've thought about it for months. I've built something extraordinary. Walker Technologies is about to close a round that'll put us in the billions, real billions, and when that happens, my whole life is going to change. The people I'm dealing with now, the investors, the board members, the men who move markets, they live in a different world. And I need a partner who fits into that world." "And I don't fit," Olivia said. Ethan sighed and leaned back in his chair as though her calm was somehow harder to deal with than tears would have been. "Look at yourself," he said. "You cook, you clean. You won't come to the galas. When I bring the Hendersons over for dinner, you sit there and say nothing. You wear the same 3 dresses. You had a chance to be somebody, Olivia, to grow with me, and you chose to stay small. And I can't be married to small anymore. I have to think about my image." "Your image," she repeated. "Yes, my image, the way the world sees me. It matters, Olivia, whether you understand that or not. Perception is power in my business. And when people look at the man who built one of the fastest-growing AI companies in America, they should see a king, not a king with a housewife folding towels in the kitchen." He said it plainly without cruelty in his voice, which somehow made it crueler. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't angry. He was simply stating what he took to be an obvious fact, the way a man might explain why he was trading in an old car. Olivia was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't shake. "Is there someone else?" she asked. Ethan hesitated, and in that hesitation she had her answer, but she waited for him to say it out loud anyway. "Her name is Victoria," he said. "Victoria Sterling. And before you say anything, no, this isn't some cheap affair. It's not like that. Victoria understands ambition. She understands the world I'm entering. She's young, she's connected, she moves in the right circles. When I walk into a room with her doors open, when I walk into a room with you, people ask if you're my assistant." That one landed. Olivia's jaw tightened just slightly, the only crack she allowed to show. But still, she did not scream. She did not throw the papers back in his face. She did not beg. Instead, she asked him one question, and it was a question so quiet, so simple, that Ethan would spend the rest of his life hearing it in his sleep. "Ethan," she said, "after everything we built together, after everything I gave you, do you really believe that I was the thing holding you back?" He looked away. He didn't answer. He couldn't, because somewhere deep beneath 10 years of ego and ambition and self-congratulation, there was a small voice that knew the truth, and he did not want to hear it. So he looked at the window instead, at the reflection of his own successful, handsome, ungrateful face. And that silence that turning away was all the answer Olivia needed. She picked up the pen. "Wait," Ethan said, surprised despite himself. "You're not even going to fight me on this. Why would I fight for a man who's already gone?" she said. She signed her name on the first line, Olivia Bennett. Neat small letters. Then she turned to the second page and the third signing wherever the little colored tabs told her to sign. Ethan watched, and for reasons he couldn't quite name her, calm unsettled him. "There's a settlement," he said. "You'll be taken care of. The house, obviously you can stay here, or if you'd rather I can buy you a—" "I don't want the house," Olivia said, still signing. Ethan blinked. "It's worth $12 million, Olivia." "I know what it's worth. There's the accounts, the stock. Under Texas law, you're entitled to half of everything I don't want your money, Ethan." He stopped. He actually stopped talking, which was rare for Ethan Walker, and stared at her as though she'd started speaking a foreign language. "You don't want the money," he said slowly. "No. Half of Walker Technologies is worth, do you have any idea what you're walking away from? Do you understand the numbers we're talking about here?" Olivia set the pen down. She squared the pages into a neat stack and slid them back across the table to him gently, the way you'd hand something back to a child. "I understand the numbers better than you'll ever know," she said. He laughed. He couldn't help it. It came out of him before he could stop it, a short, disbelieving laugh, and the moment it left his mouth, he saw something flicker across her face. Not hurt. Something else. Something that, if he'd been a wiser man, might have frightened him. "You think this is funny?" she said. "No, Olivia, I'm trying to protect you here. You've never worked a day in the 10 years we've been married. You gave up whatever little career you might have had, and now you're telling me you want to walk out of a $12 million house with nothing. Where are you going to go? What are you going to do?" She stood up. "That's not your concern anymore," she said. "You made sure of that when you signed those papers." She walked out of this room. Ethan sat there alone at the long marble table, listening to her move through the house. He expected to hear her cry. He expected maybe that she'd come back and ask him to reconsider. Instead, 10 minutes later, she came back down the stairs carrying a single small suitcase. That was all. One suitcase, the kind you could fit in the overhead bin of an airplane. "That's everything?" he asked. "Everything that's mine," she said. She paused at the door, and for just a moment she looked back at him, and something in her eyes made his stomach turn over, though he couldn't have said why. "You know what the saddest part is, Ethan," she said. "It's not that you stopped loving me. People fall out of love. That happens. The saddest part is that you never once in 10 years wondered who I really was. You never asked. You looked at the towels and the quiet dresses, and you decided you already knew everything there was to know. And you were so sure you were the smartest man in every room that it never occurred to you that you might be wrong. Olivia." "Goodbye, Ethan. I hope she's everything you think she is." And then the door closed behind her, and she was gone. Ethan Walker stood alone in his beautiful, expensive, empty house, and he told himself that he felt relieved. He told himself this was the right decision, the smart decision, the decision a man on his way to greatness had to make. He poured himself a drink and stood at the window and looked out at the city lights, and he raised his glass to the future. He did not know, could not have known, that he had just made the single greatest mistake of his life, because the woman he had just watched walk out his front door with one small suitcase was not Olivia Bennett, simple housewife. Not really. That name and that quiet life had been a costume she'd worn for 10 years, worn for him because of a hope she'd been holding on to since the very beginning. Her full name was Catherine Olivia Bennett Sterling. And she was the hidden heir to the Sterling Foundation, a private financial empire whose true worth had never been printed in any magazine because the family that controlled it had spent a century making sure it never would be. Over $1 trillion. Quiet capital moving through technology and healthcare and energy and global finance shaping markets that men like Ethan believed they were conquering all on their own. For 10 years, she had hidden all of it. And she had hidden it for one reason and one reason only. She had wanted to know if her husband loved her. Just her. Not her name, not her fortune. Not what her family's signature could do to a man's future with a single stroke of a pen. She had wanted more than she had ever wanted anything to be loved as an ordinary woman by a man who saw her as enough. And now at last, after 10 long years, she had her answer. To understand how a woman worth $1 trillion ended up folding towels in a kitchen for a man who thought she was beneath him, you have to go back. Back before the glass house, before the billions, before Victoria Sterling and her perfect smile. You have to go back to a rented one-bedroom apartment in East Austin where a young man named Ethan Walker had a dream and nothing else. They had met at a coffee shop. She was reading a book in the corner and he was hunched over a laptop that was held together with duct tape, muttering to himself and running his hands through his hair. His card had been declined at the register. She'd watched his face flush red, watched him whisper an apology and start to put the coffee back, and before she'd even decided to do it, she'd stepped up beside him and told the cashier to put it on her order. "You didn't have to do that," he'd said, embarrassed. "I know," she'd said, "but you looked like a man having a bad day. And bad days are easier with coffee." They'd talked for 3 hours that afternoon. He told her about his idea, this crazy, impossible idea about machines that could learn, and his eyes had lit up in a way she'd never seen in any of the polished, wealthy, calculating men her family kept trying to introduce her to. Ethan Walker had nothing. No money, no connections, no last name that opened doors. And that was exactly what had drawn her to him. For the first time in her life, she'd met a man who wanted her to believe in his dream, not his bank account, because he thought she was as broke and ordinary as he was. She never corrected him. That had been the beginning of the game she played, the beautiful, dangerous game. She told him her name was Olivia Bennett. All true, technically, just not the whole of it. She let him assume she came from nothing, and he never questioned it because it fit the story he wanted to tell about himself, the story of the self-made man and the simple girl who loved him. They married 11 months later in a courthouse with 2 strangers as witnesses. No family. She told him hers was gone distant complicated, and he never pressed because he was too consumed by his own ambition to be curious about hers. And then came the hard years, the years no magazine would ever write about. When Walker Technologies was 6 months from bankruptcy and Ethan couldn't make payroll and 3 of his engineers were about to walk, it was Olivia who quietly sold her grandmother's necklace, a piece worth more than Ethan's entire company at the time, though she told him she'd gotten a few thousand for some old jewelry. She'd handed him the cash and said, "Pay your people, Ethan. Good people are worth more than pride." When investors laughed him out of their offices, it was Olivia who sat with him at 2 in the morning, holding his hand while he shook with despair, telling him over and over that she believed in him, that the world just hadn't caught up to him yet. And in the shadows where he could not see, there were other things. A venture fund that suddenly reversed its decision and put in a critical early check. A door at a major firm that mysteriously opened after months of rejection. A supplier who suddenly extended favorable terms. Ethan called it luck. He called it the market finally recognizing his genius. He never once suspected that a quiet hand was moving pieces on the board, clearing a path, giving him just enough of a lift to let him believe he'd climbed the whole way himself. Because that was the whole point. She never wanted him to know. She wanted him to succeed, yes, but more than that, she wanted to watch what success would do to him. She wanted to know if the man who had nothing and the man who had everything would be the same man. For a while, he was. For a few beautiful years, Ethan Walker was grateful. He came home and told her about his day and asked about hers. He held her hand at the dinner table. He said more than once, "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Liv." And she had let herself believe in those years that she had found the impossible thing, a love with no price tag. But then the money came, the real money, and Ethan changed. It happened slowly, the way these things always do. First it was the clothes, then it was the car, then it was the house. Then it was the new friends, men and women who smelled money the way sharks smell blood, who told Ethan he was a visionary, a genius, the future of the entire industry. And Ethan, who had once been humbled by a declined coffee, began to believe them. He stopped asking about her day. He started introducing her at the few events she still attended as my wife and nothing more, and then correcting people who assumed she was somebody important. No, she doesn't work. She takes care of the house, said with a small laugh, said as though it were a slightly embarrassing thing. He started coming home late. Then not at all, some nights blaming meetings, blaming travel. And then 6 months ago, he had come home smelling of a perfume that was not hers, and Olivia had known. She had known long before the divorce papers ever hit the table. She could have confronted him. She could have used her real name, her real power, and destroyed the other woman, destroyed Ethan, held on to her marriage by force. But that was not what she wanted. What she wanted was the truth. She wanted him to choose, and she wanted him to choose freely, believing she was nothing, believing she had nothing, so that whatever he chose would be the real answer to the only question that had ever mattered. Did he love her, or did he love what he thought she wasn't? And now she had her answer written in his own hand on a stack of papers pushed across a marble table. He had chosen Victoria. He had chosen the image. He had looked at the woman who sold her grandmother's necklace to save his dream, and he had called her small. Olivia sat in the back of a plain black car 3 blocks from the house she had just left forever, and for the first time in a very long time, she let herself feel it. Not the anger, the grief. Because whatever else he had become, she had loved him once truly, and a part of her would always mourn the young man in the coffee shop whose eyes had lit up over an impossible dream. The driver, an older man named Harold, who had worked for her family for 30 years, watched her in the mirror. "Where to, Miss Catherine?" he asked. He was one of the very few people in the world who knew her real name. She was quiet for a moment. "Take me to the plane, Harold," she said. "I think it's time I stopped hiding." "Yes, ma'am." He paused. "If I may say so, it's good to have you back." She managed a small, sad smile. "I never really left, Harold. I just took a very long detour." As the car pulled onto the highway, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a message from the chairman of the Sterling Foundation's board, an old and loyal man named Nathaniel Cross, who had served her grandfather, and now, though the world did not know, it served her. The message read, "The board is ready whenever you are. 10 years is a long time to wait, Catherine. The family is glad you're coming home." She typed back 3 words. "I'm coming home." And then after a moment, she typed something else. A second message to a different person, to Nathaniel's private line business, now not Sentiment. "Pull the files on Walker Technologies. All of them. Investment history, board decisions, employee records, financials. I want to understand exactly what kind of company my husband built while I wasn't looking. And Nathaniel. Quietly flag them across our network. No new capital, not from us, not from anyone who listens to us, not $1. The reply came fast. "Understood. May I ask why Catherine looked out the window at the city lights sliding past the same lights her husband was toasting at that very moment, a glass raised to a future he didn't know he'd already lost? Because she typed for 10 years, I protected a man who did not deserve it. It's time to find out what he does when the protection is gone." She set the phone down in her lap. And though her heart still ached, though a part of her would grieve the marriage for a long time to come, there was underneath the grief something else now, something clear and cold and steady, not revenge. She had never been the kind of woman who lived for revenge. Justice, that was the word for it. Justice and the slow, patient unveiling of a truth 10 years in the making. Meanwhile, back in this glass house on the hill, Ethan Walker finished his drink and sent a triumphant text to Victoria Sterling. "It's done. I'm free. Let's build something the world's never seen." Victoria's reply came with a heart and a champagne emoji. "Finally. I was starting to think you'd never let go of that little housewife. Now we can really begin. The Sterlings and the Walkers. Can you imagine what our name will do?" Ethan smiled at the phone, and it did not occur to him, not even for a second, that the name Sterling might mean something. It did not occur to him that his new lover shared a surname with the most powerful private foundation on the face of the earth, or that this might be worth thinking about. He was a man who had spent his whole life not asking the right questions, and he was not about to start now. He walked upstairs past the closet, where his ex-wife's 3 simple dresses still hung, and he did not look at them. He told himself the hard part was over. He told himself the smartest thing he'd ever done was let go of the woman who'd been holding him back. He was half right. It was without question the most important decision he would ever make. He had simply gotten every other part of it wrong. Somewhere over the Atlantic hours later, a private jet with no markings and no name climbed into a sky full of stars. Inside it, a woman the world believed to be a simple Austin housewife shed the last of her disguise. She changed out of the plain clothes. She let her hair down. And when she looked at her reflection in the small mirror of the cabin, the woman looking back was not Olivia Bennet anymore. It was Catherine Sterling, the hidden queen, the heir to $1 trillion, a woman whose signature could raise a company from the dead or bury it forever, and who had just decided with the calm certainty of someone who has finally stopped waiting exactly which of those two things she was going to do to the man who called her small. She opened the file Nathaniel had sent. Page after page of Walker Technologies, the real story of it, the story underneath the headlines, and as she read her expression grew still and grave, because there were things in these files, ugly things, decisions Ethan had made in the last 2 years when the money had gone to his head that she had known nothing about. Corners cut, people used, numbers that did not quite add up in ways that were not accidents. "Oh, Ethan," she murmured to the empty cabin, "what did you do while I was busy loving you?" She read until the sun came up over the ocean. And by the time the jet began its descent, she understood something that her husband did not yet understand himself. His empire was already dead. He just hadn't noticed the body was cold. The banks would start pulling back within weeks. The investors would vanish. The friends who called him a genius would stop returning his calls. And the great project he was staking everything on, the one he'd named Genesis, the $700 million bet that was supposed to make him a legend, would find every door in the financial world quietly, politely, permanently closed. Not because Catherine had lifted a finger to destroy him. She wouldn't need to. She only had to do one thing. She only had to stop protecting him. For 10 years, an invisible hand had caught Ethan Walker every time he stumbled, had smoothed his path, had whispered to the right people at the right moments. He had never known it was there. He had believed with his whole heart that he walked alone and walked tall. Now he really would walk alone. And the world was about to find out how far a man like that could get on nothing but arrogance and a borrowed name. The jet touched down as morning broke. Catherine Sterling stepped out into the cold, clean air of a new day, and Harold's counterpart on this side of the ocean, a driver just as loyal and just as old, opened the door of a waiting car and bowed his head. "Welcome home, Miss Catherine," he said. "The board has assembled, and there is a man from Austin, a Mr. Walker, who has just requested an urgent meeting with the chairman of the Sterling Foundation. He seems to be under the impression the chairman is a stranger who might save his company." Catherine paused one hand on the door of the car, and for the first time since she'd signed those papers, a small smile touched the corner of her mouth. Not a cruel smile, a sad one, the smile of a woman who has waited a very long time for a truth she already knew and now must finally face. "Tell him," she said, "that the chairman will see him." "And who shall I say the chairman is, ma'am?" She got into the car and folded her hands in her lap, the same way she had folded them at that marble table the night her husband threw her away. "Don't tell him anything," she said. "Let him find out the way I found out who he really was, in person, when it's already too late to take it back." The car pulled away, and the woman the world would soon come to know as the trillion-dollar queen rode toward the reckoning her husband had spent 10 years earning and did not yet know was coming for him at all. The morning after the divorce, Ethan Walker woke up feeling like a king. He stretched across the enormous bed alone, and for the first time in months, he did not feel the low, nagging weight of guilt he'd been carrying. It was done. The papers were signed. The quiet woman with the plain dresses was gone, and now his life could finally become what it was always meant to be. He reached for his phone, and there were 43 messages waiting, and every single one of them made him smile. The first was from Victoria. "Good morning, future legend. Breakfast at the Driscoll. I want to be seen with you," he typed back on my way, and he practically leapt out of bed. 3 months. That was how long the dream lasted. 3 golden months where everything Ethan had bet his marriage on seemed to pay off exactly as he'd imagined. He and Victoria Sterling became the couple that Austin, and then the whole country, could not stop talking about. They appeared at a charity gala, and the photographs ran in every business magazine in America. They flew to Los Angeles on a chartered jet and had dinner with 2 studio executives and a senator. They were photographed on a yacht off the coast of Miami, Victoria, in a white dress, Ethan in sunglasses, both of them laughing at something the camera couldn't hear. "This," Victoria said one night, spinning slowly in the middle of a hotel suite that cost more per night than most people earned in a month, "is what we were made for. Do you feel it, Ethan? The whole world is finally looking at us." "I feel it," he said. And he did. He felt like a man who had finally arrived. He told himself in those first weeks that he'd been right about everything. He told himself that Olivia would have hated all of this, the noise and the lights and the endless performance of being important, and that proved his point. She never belonged. Victoria belonged. Victoria understood. What he did not notice, because he did not want to notice, was that Victoria never once asked him a single question about himself. Not about his childhood, not about his fears, not about the company that had made him. She asked about the guest list. She asked who else would be at the party. She asked whether the magazine would put them on the cover or just the inside spread. And when it was just the inside spread, she sulked for 2 days. But Ethan was a man in love with the idea of his own success, and Victoria was the mirror that showed him that success most flatteringly. So he did not notice. Not yet. The first crack came on a Tuesday. He was in his office at Walker Technologies, riding the high of the last 3 months, preparing for the moment that was supposed to crown his entire career. The project called Genesis. It was the biggest thing he'd ever attempted, a leap so ambitious that industry insiders said it couldn't be done, and Ethan lived to prove such people wrong. Genesis needed $700 million in new investment to reach the finish line. And Ethan wasn't worried about the money. He was never worried about money. Money had always come to him easily, naturally, as though the universe itself agreed he deserved it. He'd scheduled a call that morning with Coastal Meridian Bank, the institution that had backed his last 3 rounds. A formality, really. His CFO, a careful man named David Chen, had set it up, and Ethan expected to spend 20 minutes accepting their enthusiasm. The call lasted 4 minutes. "Ethan," said the voice on the other end, a senior partner named Grady, whom Ethan had golfed with a dozen times. "I'm going to be straight with you because I respect you. We're going to pass on Genesis." Ethan laughed, sure he'd misheard. "Pass? Grady, come on. We've done 3 rounds together. You know this company." "I do. And this isn't about the company." "Not exactly." A long pause. "It's above my level, Ethan. The decision came down from the top. I can't say more than that. I'm sorry." The line went dead. Ethan sat with the phone in his hand for a full minute, staring at it, waiting for it to make sense. Then he told himself it was nothing. Coastal Meridian was one bank. There were 100 banks. There were sovereign wealth funds and private equity firms and venture giants who would trip over themselves for a piece of Genesis. He was wrong. Over the next 10 days, one by one, they all said no. Silvercrest Capital said no. The Anderson Group said no. A firm out of New York that had been courting him for a year suddenly stopped returning his calls entirely. A managing director in San Francisco, a woman Ethan considered a friend, took his call, and he could hear in the careful way she spoke that something had frightened her. "I want to help you, Ethan," she said. "You know I do, but I'd be lying if I said this was a normal situation. There's I don't know how to describe it, a chill. On your name, on the whole company. Nobody's saying anything out loud, but everybody's stepping back at the same time. And when that happens, it means somebody big moved first and the rest of us are just smart enough to follow." "Somebody big?" Ethan repeated. "Who? I don't know. I swear to you I don't. But Ethan, whoever it is, you've made an enemy you can't see. And in this business, those are the only enemies that can actually kill you." He hung up and stared out the window of his office at the city he'd once felt he owned. And for the first time in years, Ethan Walker felt the ground move under him. He called David Chen into his office that afternoon. "Find out what's happening," he said. "I don't care what it costs. I want to know who's putting a chill on my company. Somebody's poisoning the well David and I want to name." David Chen was a quiet, meticulous man, the kind of man who noticed things, and he had already begun to notice things that made his stomach tighten. He nodded and said he'd look into it. He did not say what he was afraid he might find. It took David 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, the situation went from worrying to dire. The Genesis project began to stall as suppliers, sensing weakness, demanded payment up front. 2 senior engineers, the best on the team, resigned within days of each other and would not say where they were going. And the stock Walker Technologies stock, which had been the darling of every tech portfolio in the country, began to slide. First a few percent, then more. Analysts who had praised Ethan for years began to hedge, then to warn, then to downgrade. Victoria noticed too. But Victoria noticed differently. "There's a rumor," she said one evening, not looking up from her phone, "that your company's in trouble. Marcy heard it at the Whitmans. Is it true?" "It's a rough patch," Ethan said. "It'll pass." Victoria set her phone down and looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It was the look of a woman recalculating. "How rough?" she asked. "Victoria." "I'm just asking Ethan. I have my own reputation to think about. Do you have any idea what it does to me if I'm attached to a sinking ship?" "People talk. They're already talking. Do you know that the bellwether party, the one everybody's going to, we weren't invited? For the first time, people are already stepping back from us." And there it was. Us. The way she said it, it was clear the us she was worried about was herself. "So the walls close in on me," Ethan said slowly, "and your first thought is a party." "Don't twist my words. I'm being practical. One of us has to be." She picked her phone back up. "Fix it, Ethan. Whatever it is, fix it fast. Because I did not sign up to be the girlfriend of a man everyone's whispering about." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, and for the first time in 3 months, he thought about Olivia. He thought about the night years ago when the company had nearly gone under the first time, and he'd come home shaking, sure it was over. And Olivia had made him a cup of coffee and sat beside him at the kitchen table until 3 a.m, and she'd said, "Ethan, whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere. You could lose all of it tomorrow, every dollar, and I would still be sitting right here. Do you understand me? It was never the money." He'd forgotten that. He'd forgotten it completely until this exact moment, lying in the dark next to a woman who was already looking for the exits. And the memory of it hit him so hard that he had to sit up and put his feet on the floor and breathe. But then his pride, that old faithful companion, whispered to him. "She left because she couldn't keep up," it said. "She's probably struggling somewhere, wishing she'd taken the money. Don't be sentimental. You made the right choice. Fix this and Victoria will settle down and everything will be fine." He lay back down. He believed the pride because the pride was easier to believe. 2 days later, David Chen came to his office and closed the door behind him, which he never did. "I found it," David said. His face was pale. "I found who's behind the chill." Ethan sat up straight. "Who?" David set a single sheet of paper on the desk. On it was a logo, understated elegant, and a name Ethan had heard perhaps twice in his entire life, always spoken in the hushed, careful tone that people reserved for forces they did not fully understand. "The Sterling Foundation," David said. For a moment, the name meant nothing to Ethan. Then it meant everything, and then strangely, it meant nothing again because his mind refused to hold on to what it was being told. "The what?" "The Sterling Foundation," David repeated. "Ethan, I need you to understand what this is. This isn't a bank. It's not a fund. Not like the ones we deal with. It's a private financial empire. It's old money, older than old, and it operates almost entirely in the shadows. Nobody knows its real size. The estimates I've seen range from $400 billion to over $1 trillion, and the people who'd actually know won't say. It has positions in technology, healthcare, energy, infrastructure, global finance. When it moves, other people move. When it decides it doesn't like a company, that company doesn't get funded by anyone, anywhere. Because everyone in the world of serious money is either invested alongside the Sterlings or terrified of them, and usually both." Ethan stared at the paper. "And this foundation decided it doesn't like me. Why, I've never even heard of them. I've never done business with them. Why would $1 trillion empire even know my name, let alone care enough to destroy me?" David hesitated. "That's the part I can't figure out. It doesn't make sense. Companies our size don't even register to an entity like that. It's like the ocean deciding to drown one specific fish. There's no reason for it, unless what? Unless it's personal, David said quietly. And I can't imagine how it could be. Ethan waved the idea away, but a cold finger had begun to trace its way up his spine. Sterling. The name kept catching on something in the back of his mind, some snag he couldn't smooth out. There's one more thing, David said. I did some digging into the foundation structure. It's almost impossible to find anything on the actual family. They're ghosts. But I found one old record. The foundation was consolidated and restructured about 40 years ago by the family patriarch, and the family name before the Sterlings when the fortune was first being built. It was a different name. What name? David looked at him. Bennett, he said. The room tilted. Ethan gripped the edge of his desk. Say that again. Bennett, David said. The Sterling fortune traces back to a family named Bennett. I only found it in one place, a 100-year-old incorporation document, and I almost missed it. But it's there. Sterling. Bennett. Ethan isn't that. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Ethan had gone white. Bennett. Olivia Bennett. The name he'd said 10,000 times over 10 years, the name he'd signed above his own on a marriage certificate, the name he'd handed her back with a laugh when she said she didn't want his money. I understand the numbers better than you'll ever know. No, Ethan said out loud. No, that's insane. It's a coincidence. Bennett is a common name. There are a million Bennetts. My ex-wife was a housewife, David. She grew up with nothing. She sold cheap jewelry to help me make payroll once, for God's sake. She wore the same 3 dresses for a decade. She left this house with 1 suitcase and refused $12 million because she didn't understand what she was giving up. But even as he said it, each fact he offered as proof of her ordinariness turned in his mind into evidence of the opposite. A woman who refused $12 million. A woman who left without a single fight, without a lawyer, without asking for a cent. A woman who had, on the night he threw her away, looked at him with something in her eyes that he'd been too proud to read and said, "You never once wondered who I really was." It's not her, Ethan said to himself now more than to David. It can't be her. I'm not saying it is, David said carefully. I'm just telling you what I found. But the seed was planted, and it grew fast, and it grew into a fear so large that Ethan couldn't look at it directly. Because if it was true, if by some impossible mathematics the quiet woman he'd called small was the hidden hand behind the most powerful private fortune on earth, then Ethan Walker had not simply lost a wife. He had committed a kind of suicide, and he'd done it laughing. He needed to know it wasn't true. He needed desperately to prove to himself that his marriage had been exactly what he'd always believed it was, a generous man lifting up an ordinary woman who then failed to grow. So he did something he had not done in 3 months. He tried to find her. He called the number he had for her. Disconnected. He drove to the small apartment complex where he assumed a woman with 1 suitcase and no money would have landed, and there was no Olivia Bennett listed. He called 2 of her old acquaintances, women she'd been friendly with, and neither of them had heard from her. And one of them, oddly, seemed almost amused by his question. "You're looking for Olivia," the woman said. "That's rich, Ethan, after what you did. Do you know where she is or not?" "No," the woman said. "But wherever she is, I promise you she's doing better than you are. That woman was always more than she let on. You were just the last one to figure it out." And she hung up. Ethan stood in his office, the phone in his hand, and the fear became something closer to nausea. Meanwhile, the fire kept spreading. Within a month, Walker Technologies had lost nearly 40% of its value. The Genesis project was frozen. Without the $700 million, it simply could not move, and every source of that money had turned to stone. The board of directors, men who had praised Ethan as a visionary a season ago, began holding calls he wasn't invited to. His most trusted lieutenant, the woman who ran his operations, came to him and gently, sadly told him she'd been offered a role elsewhere and was going to take it. "Rats," Ethan said bitterly. "Rats in a sinking ship." "That's not fair," she said. "I stayed longer than most would have. But Ethan, you have to see what's happening. This isn't a market cycle. Somebody's hunting you, and you don't even know why. When the person hunting you won't tell you why and won't tell you what they want, there's no deal to make. There's no peace to broker. There's just the fall. I'm sorry, I really am. But I have a family. She left, and she was one of the good ones. Victoria left too in her own way, which was to say she began building the story of her departure before she actually departed. She started spending nights at her own place to give him space to focus. She stopped being seen with him in public. She was photographed at a party he wasn't invited to, laughing on the arm of a hedge fund heir, and when Ethan called her about it, furious and afraid, she was ice. "We were never engaged, Ethan," she said. "Let's not pretend we were more than we were. I was drawn to a man who was going places, and now from everything I hear, the only place you're going is down. I'm not cruel, I'm just honest. And honestly, I have my future to think about." "You said we were made for this," Ethan said, and he hated how small his voice sounded. "You said the whole world was looking at us." "The world was looking at us," Victoria said. "Now it's looking at the wreckage, and I don't intend to be standing in it when the cameras arrive." A pause. "Goodbye, Ethan. Truly, I wish you the best. But please don't call me again. It doesn't look good for either of us." And the woman he had destroyed his marriage for was gone as easily and completely as if she had never been there at all. It took her less than 5 minutes on the phone. 10 years of loyalty from Olivia thrown away for 3 months and a 5-minute goodbye. Ethan sat alone in this glass house that night, the same house at the same marble table, and the symmetry of it was not lost on him. He had sat here 3 months ago and pushed papers across this table and felt like a king. Now he sat here abandoned, hunted by a force he couldn't see, betrayed by the woman he'd betrayed his wife to have, and the only thought that would not leave him alone was a face. Olivia's face, the way she'd looked at him at the very end. Not angry, not even hurt exactly. Something more like grief, and something else underneath the grief. Something he had refused to see because he'd been too busy congratulating himself. He got up and walked to the closet, the one he hadn't opened in 3 months, and he opened it. Her 3 dresses still hung there. He'd never gotten rid of them. He took one down and held it, this simple, cheap-looking dress, and for the first time it occurred to him to wonder why a woman who owned only 3 dresses had refused $12 million without so much as blinking. Because she didn't need it, whispered the fear. Because $12 million to her was nothing. Was a rounding error, was less than nothing. "No," he said aloud to the empty house and put the dress back. "No." He was still trying not to believe it, because to believe it fully was to understand the true size of what he had done, and the human mind protects itself from certain truths the way the eye flinches from the sun. Then 10 days later, the invitation came. It arrived not by email, but by courier, a heavy cream envelope with no return address sealed with wax, the kind of thing Ethan had assumed only existed in old movies. Inside was a single card, thick as cardboard, with elegant black lettering, and when Ethan read it, his hands began to shake. It was an invitation to a private summit of global finance to be held in a historic palace in the mountains of Switzerland. The most exclusive financial gathering in the world, an event so private that most people did not even know it existed. Heads of sovereign funds, central bankers, the controlling minds behind fortunes that shaped entire nations, and at the bottom of the card in a smaller hand was a line that stopped his heart. "The chairman of the Sterling Foundation requests the personal attendance of Mr. Ethan Walker and wishes to discuss the future of Walker Technologies." Ethan read it 6 times. The Sterling Foundation, the very force that was destroying him, the invisible hand, and now suddenly that hand was reaching out not to crush him, but to invite him to the table, to talk about his future. Hope roared up in him so violently that it drowned out everything else, the fear, the suspicion, the memory of Olivia's face. Maybe it wasn't personal after all. Maybe it had all been a misunderstanding, some mistake, some crossed wire in the machinery of a trillion-dollar empire. Maybe the chairman had heard of Genesis, understood its brilliance, and wanted to be the one to save it, to save Ethan, to make him whole again and bigger than ever. Maybe this was the moment the story turned back around. He called David Chen at midnight. "They invited me," he said, breathless, "The Sterling Foundation. The chairman wants to meet me in Switzerland to talk about the company's future." There was a long silence on David's end. "Ethan," David said slowly, "the entity that spent 2 months quietly destroying you now wants a personal meeting. Doesn't that frighten you?" "It's a lifeline, David." "Or it's the spider inviting the fly to lunch. Ethan, please think about this. Nobody knows who the chairman even is. That's the whole mystery of the foundation. In 40 years, no one has ever confirmed the identity of the person at the top. And now that person out of nowhere wants to sit across a table from you specifically. Why? Why does the most powerful and secretive figure in global finance care about a man running a mid-sized AI company that's already circling the drain? It doesn't add up unless what?" Ethan said, and his own voice had gone quiet because some part of him already had known since David first said the name Bennett and had spent 2 months refusing to know. "Unless it was always personal," David finished softly. "Unless you already know exactly who the chairman is, and you just can't let yourself say it." Ethan didn't answer. His eyes had drifted across the dark living room to the closet where 3 simple dresses hung. "I understand the numbers better than you'll ever know. You never once wondered who I really was." "I'm going to Switzerland," Ethan said. "Ethan, I don't have a choice, David. If I don't go, the company's finished for certain. If I go, maybe there's a chance. And if I'm wrong about who's waiting for me there, then it doesn't matter anyway." He swallowed. "And if I'm right, then I need to look her in the eye. I need to hear it from her. I owe her at least that much, even if I owe her everything else, too." He hung up before David could argue. The flight to Switzerland was the longest of his life. He had made this kind of journey 100 times first-class private cars. The easy comfort of a man with money. But this time he flew commercial because the private jet contract had been quietly canceled by a service that no longer trusted his credit. And that small humiliation told him more about how far he'd fallen than any spreadsheet could. He sat in his seat 30,000 feet over the ocean, and he did something he hadn't done in 10 years. He remembered his marriage honestly. He remembered the coffee shop, and the way she'd paid for his drink when his card was declined, and the way she'd looked at him not with pity, but with a kind of steady warmth, as though she'd already decided he was worth something. He remembered the 2 a.m. conversations, her hand in his, her voice saying it was never the money. He remembered the necklace she'd sold, the one she'd said was worth a few thousand, and he understood now with a sick certainty that it had probably been worth more than everything he'd owned at the time, and that she'd let him believe otherwise so he could keep his pride. He remembered every quiet sacrifice, every moment she'd stepped back, so he could step forward every dinner where he'd introduced her as just my wife, and she'd smiled and said nothing. And he remembered most of all the thing he'd spent 3 months refusing to remember, which was that she had never, not once in 10 years, made him feel small. It had been the other way around the entire time. She had spent a decade making a broke, frightened, arrogant young man feel like a king. And the moment he actually became one, he'd used the crown she gave him to cast her out. "What did I do?" he whispered alone in a coach seat over the Atlantic. "God help me. What did I do?" He landed in the cold, clear morning of the Swiss mountains, and a car was waiting for him, sleek and black and silent, with a driver who said nothing and asked for no name, as though he already knew exactly who he was collecting and where to take him. They wound up into the mountains higher and higher toward a palace that had stood for 400 years, and Ethan sat in the back seat with his hands clenched in his lap and his heart pounding. He tried to prepare himself. He tried to imagine walking into that room and finding a stranger, some silver-haired old financier, who would explain that this had all been a misunderstanding, and he tried to imagine the relief he would feel. But underneath, in the place where the truth lived, he already knew. He'd known since David said the name Bennett. He'd known since Victoria walked away in 5 minutes, showing him in miniature exactly what a love with no loyalty looked like, and forcing him to compare it at last to the love he'd thrown away. He was going to walk into that palace, and he was going to find the woman he'd called small, standing at the top of an empire he couldn't even comprehend, and he was going to have to look her in the eye. The car climbed the last of the mountain road as the sun broke over the peaks and the palace rose up ahead, and somewhere inside it, a woman in an elegant black gown stood by a window that overlooked the whole white world, waiting as she had waited for 10 years for the man who had never once wondered who she really was to finally find out. The doors of the palace opened, and Ethan Walker stepped inside the most exclusive gathering of wealth on earth, and for the first time in his life, he felt like an imposter. He had spent 10 years learning how to walk into a room like he owned it. He knew the trick of it, the shoulders back, the easy smile, the handshake that lasted exactly the right amount of time. But those tricks were for rooms full of men who wanted to be impressed. This room was different. This room was full of people who could not be impressed because they had quite literally seen and bought everything. And they looked at Ethan as he entered some of them, with the mild, distant curiosity of people watching a man walk toward a cliff he couldn't see. A woman in a crisp gray suit approached him. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I'm Eleanor Voss. I serve the foundation. The chairman is expecting you, but not quite yet. There's a small matter of protocol. Please come with me." "Protocol," Ethan repeated. "The chairman prefers to make an entrance," Eleanor said with the faintest ghost of a smile that Ethan couldn't read. "You'll wait in the West Gallery. Others are waiting there as well. Some of them have been seeking a meeting with the chairman for years and have never been granted one. You should understand what an unusual honor this is to be summoned personally. Whatever you did to earn the chairman's attention, Mr. Walker, it was remarkable." There was something in the way she said it, some private weight, that made Ethan's stomach knot. "You know who the chairman is," he said. "Don't you?" "Everyone who works for the foundation knows," Eleanor said. "It's the world that doesn't." "Then tell me." She stopped and turned to face him fully, and for a moment her professional mask slipped, and what showed underneath was something almost like pity. "No, Mr. Walker," she said gently. "I don't think I will. Some things a man has to see with his own eyes, or he'll never truly believe them. And I suspect you already know. I suspect you've known for some time, and you've come all this way hoping to be proven wrong. I'm sorry. I don't think you're going to be." And she walked on, and Ethan followed, his mouth dry, his pulse loud in his ears. The West Gallery was long and quiet, and there were perhaps a dozen people in it, and Ethan recognized 2 of them, and both of them recognized him, and both of them looked away. That more than anything told him how far he had fallen. These were men who 6 months ago would have crossed a crowded room to shake his hand. Now they studied the artwork on the walls rather than meet his eyes the way people avoid looking at a man they've heard is dying. He stood alone by a window. Below him the mountains fell away into white, and above him a ceiling 400 years old arched into shadow, and Ethan Walker waited and thought about his wife. He thought about the last thing she'd said to him. "You never once wondered who I really was." He'd taken it at the time as the wounded pride of a woman being left. He understood now that it had been something else entirely. It had been a door held open, a last chance offered even in the moment of her leaving for him to become curious to look at her and finally see her. And he had failed even that. He had let her walk out the door and toasted the future with a glass of scotch. An hour passed. He knew because a great clock somewhere in the palace struck the hour, and the sound of it rolled through the stone halls like something out of a dream. And then Eleanor Voss reappeared at his side, silent as a ghost. "The chairman will see you now," she said. "Alone, in the north salon. Down the corridor, the last door. Go in when you're ready." A pause. "Take a breath first, Mr. Walker. I think you're going to need it." Ethan's legs felt like they belonged to someone else as he walked the length of that corridor. Each step echoed. The other men in the gallery watched him go, and he could feel their eyes on his back, could feel them thinking, whatever's behind that door, better him than us. He reached the end. A pair of tall doors, dark wood, carved with a pattern he didn't recognize. He put his hand on the handle. He stopped. For one last moment, he let himself hope. Let himself believe that when he opened this door, he would find a stranger. An old man in a suit. A misunderstanding he could talk his way out of. His whole life, Ethan had been able to talk his way out of anything. He opened the door. The room was long and high, warm with the light of a great fireplace, and at the far end of it, standing at a tall window that looked out over the endless white of the mountains, was a woman in an elegant black gown. Her back was to him. She did not turn. And even before she spoke, Ethan felt his whole body go cold, because he knew that posture. He knew the set of those shoulders. He had watched them for 10 years across 1,000 dinner tables. He had held them in the dark on the worst nights of his life. "Mr. Walker," the woman said, without turning around. Her voice was calm, even carrying easily across the length of the room. "You traveled a very long way to ask for help." The voice hit him like a physical blow. He grabbed the back of a chair to keep himself upright. "You made quite a journey," she continued. "Commercial, I understand. That must have been unpleasant after everything you're used to. But then we adjust to a great many things we once thought impossible, don't we?" She turned, and it was her. It was Olivia. But it was not the Olivia he knew. The plain dresses were gone. The simple pulled-back hair was gone. The quiet, downcast eyes that had watched him across a marble table 3 months ago were gone. Standing before him was a woman he had never met and yet had been married to for 10 years. A woman who carried herself with an ease and an authority that filled the enormous room, a woman before whom the most powerful people on earth waited in a gallery for the honor of an audience. "Olivia," he breathed. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "That woman was the one who loved you, Ethan. She's not here anymore. You signed her away 3 months ago. My name is Catherine Olivia Bennett Sterling, chairman of the Sterling Foundation, heir to everything you've spent the last 2 months running from." A pause. "It's good to see you, Ethan, though I confess I imagined this moment a great deal, and in none of my imaginings did you look quite so afraid." Ethan's mind refused it even now, even with the proof standing 10 feet in front of him. This can't be. You're my wife. You made me coffee. You folded towels. You sold your grandmother's necklace to help me make payroll. You got a few $1,000s for it. That necklace, Catherine said quietly, was appraised at $1.9 million. It had belonged to my great-grandmother. I sold it through a private broker in Geneva, and I gave you the cash, and I told you it was a few thousand because you needed to keep your dignity, and because if I had handed you $2 million, you would have started asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. She let that settle. You paid your engineers with it, Ethan. You saved your company with a piece of my family's history, and you never knew, and I never wanted you to. That was the whole point. Ethan sank into the chair he'd been gripping. His legs simply would not hold him. 10 years, he said. You hid this for 10 years. Why would you? His voice cracked. Why would anyone do that? Catherine walked slowly toward the fire, her hands folded in front of her, and when she spoke, her voice lost some of its steel, and for a moment the woman he'd known showed through the woman he hadn't. Because of a man named Charles, she said, my father. He married my mother, believing she was a schoolteacher he'd met on a train. She let him believe it for 2 years, and when he finally learned who she really was, that she was a sterling heir, that she was worth more than he could imagine, he wept. Not with joy, Ethan, with grief, because he told her he could never again be sure. He could never again know whether he'd have loved her the same way if he'd known from the start. That doubt lived in their marriage until the day he died. My mother told me that story when I was 19, and I decided then that I would never live with that doubt, that when I loved a man and married a man, I would know for certain that he loved me and not my name. There was only one way to be sure. She looked at him. He had to not know. He had to love me when he thought I was nothing. The room was silent except for the crackle of the fire. I chose you, Ethan, she went on. In that coffee shop I watched a young man with a broken laptop and a declined credit card and eyes full of a dream, and I thought, there is a man who might love me for me, because he doesn't have a reason not to. He thinks I'm as broke as he is. And for years I was right. For years you loved me. Do you remember you'd come home and tell me every small thing about your day and ask about mine? You held my hand. You told me you couldn't have done any of it without me. And you meant it. I know you meant it because I was watching very closely, Ethan. I was watching for 10 years. I was administering a test you didn't know you were taking every single day. Catherine, and you passed, she said. For years you passed, and then the money came, and I watched a different test begin, the hardest one, the one my father never had to face because he never got rich enough to be corrupted by it. I watched to see whether the man who loved me when he had nothing would still love me when he had everything. Her voice dropped, and something moved behind her eyes, some old grief finally surfacing. And you failed, Ethan. You looked at the woman who sold her grandmother's necklace for you, who sat up with you at 2 a.m, who never once asked you for anything but your love, and you called her small. You called her a weakness. You pushed papers across a table and told her she didn't fit your image. And you did it for a woman named Victoria Sterling, which I have to tell you is a coincidence so absurd I almost laughed when I first heard the name. She's no relation, just an ambitious girl who liked the sound of a rich last name same as you did. Ethan flinched. Where is she now, by the way? Catherine asked with a mildness that was worse than cruelty. Victoria, the woman who understood ambition, the woman who belonged in your world. Is she waiting for you back in Austin? Is she standing by you in your hour of need the way a partner should? Ethan said nothing. He couldn't. No, Catherine said softly. I didn't think so. I read that she left the moment the money got frightening. 5 minutes on the phone, was it? 10 years of loyalty from me, and you traded it for someone who couldn't give you 5 minutes when it counted. She shook her head. I didn't do that to you, Ethan. I want you to understand that. I didn't turn Victoria against you. I didn't have to. I just stopped protecting you, and reality did the rest. Reality is a very efficient teacher when I get out of its way. And there it was. The thing Ethan had been circling for months, the thing he could no longer avoid. The chill, he said hoarsely. The banks, the investors, Genesis, all of it, that was you. That was me, Catherine agreed. Or rather, that was the absence of me. Ethan, you never understood how you succeeded. That was always your great blindness. You thought you climbed the mountain alone. You didn't. Every time you were about to fall, a hand caught you. Every door that mysteriously opened, every fund that reversed its decision at the last moment, every supplier who suddenly gave you terms you didn't deserve. That was my hand, Ethan. Quiet and visible, always just enough of a lift to let you believe you'd done it yourself. For 10 years, I was the wind under you, and you thought you were flying. Ethan stared at her, and the whole architecture of his life, everything he'd believed about himself, his genius, his destiny, his self-made greatness began to crumble in real time, brick by brick. No, he whispered. I built that company. The technology, the vision that was mine. The vision was yours, Catherine said, and there was even a kind of gentleness in it now. I'll give you that. You were brilliant, Ethan. You genuinely were. That's what made you worth believing in the beginning. But brilliance isn't enough in this world. Brilliance without capital dies in a garage, and you had capital, endless, patient, invisible capital, because a woman who loved you decided you deserved a chance. I didn't build your company, but I made it possible for you to build it. And the difference between those two things is the difference between where you were a year ago and where you're standing right now. She spread her hands. This is what it looks like, Ethan, when the wind stops. Ethan put his face in his hands. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. Snow fell silently past the tall windows. And a man who had thought he had everything sat in a borrowed chair in a 400-year-old palace and understood finally completely the size of what he had thrown away. When he lowered his hands, his eyes were wet. I came here to beg, he said. I'm not too proud to admit that anymore. I came to beg the mysterious chairman for $700 million to save Genesis. I rehearsed it on the plane. A broken laugh. And now I find out the chairman is my wife, the wife I threw away. So I suppose I'm not begging a stranger. I'm begging you. He looked up at her. Catherine, give me another chance. Not with the company. With you. I know what I did. I know it better now than I've ever known anything. I was a fool, and worse than a fool, I was ungrateful and cruel and blind. But the man you met in that coffee shop, he's still in here somewhere. I remember him now. You made me remember him. Please, let me be him again. Let me love you the way you deserve to be loved, the way I did, before the money poisoned me. I don't care about the empire. I don't care about the $1 trillion. I'll walk away from all of it. Just please, give me the chance to make it right." And for a moment, just a moment, something flickered across Catherine Sterling's face. Because she had loved him once truly and completely, and the memory of that love was not a thing that vanished just because it had been betrayed. She stood there in her black gown, the most powerful woman in the room, in the building, in perhaps the entire world of finance, and she looked at the wreck of the man she'd once believed in, and her eyes shone. "You have no idea," she said quietly, "how much I wanted to hear you say that. A year ago, 2 years ago, any day before you put those papers on the table. I would have given up all of it, Ethan. The name, the fortune, all of it, to hear you choose me when you thought I had nothing to offer but myself." A tear slipped down her cheek and she let it. "But you didn't say it then. You said it now. And do you know what the difference is? A year ago I had $1 trillion and you didn't know. Now you know. And I will never, ever again be able to tell whether you want me or whether you want the wind under your wings. You've made it impossible. The one thing I built my whole hidden life to protect against the doubt my father lived with until he died, you've handed it to me. Not by leaving me, by coming back only after you found out who I am." Ethan opened his mouth, but she raised a hand and he fell silent. "If you had found me while I was still hiding," she said, "if you'd come to some little apartment where you thought I was scraping by and you'd said those exact words, I might have believed you. I might have run into your arms. But you found me here, in this palace, at the top of an empire that can save your dying company with a signature. And you'll never be able to prove to me, and I'll never be able to prove to myself, that the man asking for another chance isn't just a drowning man reaching for the biggest life raft he's ever seen." She wiped the tear away, and when she lowered her hand, the steel was back. "You didn't just break my heart, Ethan. You broke the one thing that could have let me trust you again. And you did it 3 months ago at a marble table with a laugh." Ethan bowed his head. He had no answer. There was no answer. "So no," Catherine said, "I will not give you another chance. Not with me." She turned back toward the window, toward the mountains. "But that isn't why I brought you here. I didn't fly you across the world to reject a marriage proposal. I could have done that with silence. I brought you here for something else." Ethan looked up wary. "What?" "Justice," Catherine said. And her voice, when she said it, was no longer the voice of a grieving wife. It was the voice of the chairman of the Sterling Foundation. "You see, Ethan, when I decided to stop protecting you, I did something I'd never allowed myself to do in 10 years. I actually looked. I pulled every file on Walker Technologies, every board decision, every financial report, every employee record, every deal you closed in the last 2 years when the money went to your head, and I wasn't watching closely enough. And I have to tell you," she turned back to face him, and her expression had changed entirely, "I did not like what I found." The blood drained from Ethan's face. "What are you talking about?" Catherine walked to a table by the fire, where a thick folder sat one he hadn't noticed. She rested her hand on it. "I'm talking about the fact that when your company started struggling last year, before I ever entered the picture, you made choices," she said. "I'm talking about wages you withheld from your lowest paid workers while you were buying a yacht for Victoria. I'm talking about a safety issue in your manufacturing partner's facility that you knew about, that you were warned about in writing, and that you buried because fixing it would have hurt your margins in a critical quarter. I'm talking about financial reports, Ethan, that were presented to investors that contained numbers you knew were not honest, numbers you inflated to keep the valuation climbing. That's not just unethical. That's the kind of thing that ends with men like you in handcuffs. That's not you don't understand the context. I understand the context perfectly, Catherine said coldly. The context is that a brilliant man became a corrupt one the moment he stopped being afraid of losing everything. The context is that the same arrogance that let you throw away your marriage let you throw away your integrity. The context, Ethan, is that the man I married would have gone hungry before he cheated a single employee out of a paycheck, and the man standing in front of me did it to buy a yacht. She lifted the folder. This is the real Walker Technologies, not the magazine covers. This. Ethan stared at the folder as though it were a loaded gun. What are you going to do with that? And here, Catherine Sterling did something that surprised even herself. She smiled, sadly, almost tenderly. Nothing, she said. Ethan blinked. Nothing, I'm not going to do anything with it, Ethan. I told you. I didn't come here for revenge. Revenge is for small people, and whatever else I am not small no matter what you once called me. She set the folder down. I don't have to destroy you. I don't have to leak these files or call the regulators or drag you through the courts. I don't have to lift a finger. Because everything in that folder is real, and it was always going to come out eventually the way rot always comes to the surface. For years I kept it from surfacing. I smoothed things over. I made problems quietly disappear before they could hurt you, because I loved you, and I told myself the good in you outweighed the rest. But I'm not protecting you anymore, Ethan. And a company built on the things in this folder without someone protecting it doesn't survive contact with the truth. It falls. On its own, under its own weight. She met his eyes. I'm not going to push you off the cliff. I'm just going to stop holding you back from it, and we both know which way you're already leaning. Ethan understood then the full and terrible elegance of it. She would not raise a hand against him. She didn't need to. She had spent 10 years being the reason he didn't fall, and now she would simply be absent, and his own choices, his own corruption, his own arrogance would do to him what no enemy ever could. You're going to let me drown, he said hollowly. I'm going to let you be exactly who you chose to become, Catherine said. There's a difference. I gave you everything, Ethan. Love, loyalty, a fortune you didn't even know you were standing on. And you looked at all of it and decided it wasn't enough, that you deserved more, that the woman who gave it to you was holding you back. She walked toward the door toward him and stopped just in front of him, close enough that he could see the woman he'd married in the woman he'd never known. You didn't lose me because you chose another woman, Ethan. Victoria was a symptom. You lost me because somewhere along the way you became a man who could no longer recognize what things were worth. You held $1 trillion in your hands every night for 10 years, and you thought it was nothing because it wore plain dresses and made you coffee. That was never a failure of luck. It was a failure of vision, and a man who can't see value, Ethan does not get to keep it. She reached past him and opened the door. Eleanor will see you out, she said. There's a car waiting to take you back down the mountain. Your request for investment is denied. There will be no help from the Sterling Foundation, and I think you'll find when you get home that there's very little left to save regardless. She paused. Goodbye, Ethan. I did love you. That part was real. I want you to carry that with you. Every good thing you thought we had, we had. I just wasn't the person you thought I was, and it turned out in the end, neither were you. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway. He wanted to say something, anything, to reach back across the ruin and touch the thing they'd once had. But there were no words big enough, and he knew it, and so did she. He walked out. Behind him, the doors of the North Salon closed with a soft final sound, and Catherine Sterling stood alone by the great window, and only then, with no one left to see, did she press her hand to her mouth and let herself weep once briefly for the young man in the coffee shop with the broken laptop and the impossible dream, the man she had loved, the man who was already gone long before he ever walked out her door. Then she wiped her eyes and squared her shoulders and became the chairman again. Because there were people waiting. There was an empire to run. And the woman named Olivia, the one who folded towels and believed in a man who called her small, was finally truly laid to rest. Down the mountain in the back of a silent black car, Ethan Walker watched the palace disappear behind him and understood that he was not riding away from a failed business meeting. He was riding away from the wreckage of the single greatest gift his life had ever offered him, a gift he had held in his hands for 10 years and thrown away for an image in a magazine. And waiting for him at the bottom of the mountain and across an ocean was the collapse of everything he had left. The car reached the bottom of the mountain, and Ethan Walker began the long journey home to watch everything he had built come apart. He flew commercial again, wedged into a middle seat this time, and somewhere over the Atlantic, he made a decision that would define the last worst chapter of his fall. He decided he would not accept it. He decided that Catherine Sterling, for all her power, for all her calm certainty, was still just his wife, the quiet woman who'd folded his towels, and that a man like him, a genius, a builder, a survivor, was not going to be brought down by a woman who'd spent a decade making him coffee. Somewhere in the thin, cold air, his grief curdled back into pride, and his pride, as it always had, whispered the lie he most wanted to hear. "She's bluffing," the pride said. "She's hurt, and she's making you pay, but she still loves you. She said so." She wept. "A woman who weeps for you can be won back, and even if she can't, you don't need her. You built this once with nothing. You'll do it again." By the time the plane touched down in Austin, Ethan was no longer a broken man begging for another chance. He was something more dangerous. He was a desperate man who had convinced himself he still had cards to play. He was wrong about that, too. The first sign was the parking lot. He drove to the offices of Walker Technologies at 8 in the morning, and the lot, which should have been half full, held perhaps a dozen cars. He walked into a lobby that felt like a tomb. The receptionist, a young woman named Priya, who had worked for him for 3 years, looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Mr. Walker," she said, "you're back. We didn't know if you were coming back." "Of course I'm back," Ethan said. "Where is everyone?" Priya's lip trembled. "A lot of people didn't come in this week. And Mr. Chen, he's been trying to reach you for 2 days. It's bad, Mr. Walker, it's really bad." David Chen was in the conference room, and when Ethan walked in, David looked up with the face of a man who had not slept in a week. "You're back," David said. "I've been calling you." "My phone died over the Atlantic," Ethan said. "Tell me where we are." David slid a single sheet of paper across the table, and Ethan looked at it, and the number at the bottom of it made the floor drop out of his stomach. "The stock opened this morning down another 31%. David said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "That's on top of everything from the last 2 months. We've now lost over 80% of our value since the spring. Ethan, we are not a billion-dollar company anymore. We're barely a company at all, and it's not stopping. Every hour it drops further." "Why?" Ethan said. "What happened while I was gone? What triggered this?" David hesitated, and then he said the words Ethan had been dreading since the palace. "The reports came out," David said. "The financial reports, the real ones. Somebody I don't know who sent a detailed package to 3 major business journalists and 2 regulatory bodies. Everything, Ethan. The inflated valuations, the numbers we presented to investors that weren't true. And the manufacturing issue, the safety problem at the Rendon facility, the one you told me to sit on. It's all out, all of it, in print, with documentation." Ethan gripped the edge of the table. "She said she wouldn't," he whispered. "She told me she wouldn't touch it. She said she'd just let it fall on its own." "Who?" David said sharply. "Who told you that Ethan who did this?" But Ethan wasn't listening. His mind was racing, and it landed on the wrong conclusion the way it always did, because a proud man in freefall reaches for the explanation that lets him keep his rage instead of his responsibility. "She lied to me," he thought. "She stood in that palace and told me she'd take no revenge, and then she buried me the moment I was in the air. It was all a performance. The tears, the speech about her father, all of it a game to make me feel the knife going in." He was wrong about that, too. Catherine had not sent the package. She had told him the truth in the palace precisely and completely. She had done nothing. But she had also told him something he'd been too proud to really hear. That the rot was always going to surface once she stopped smoothing it over. And so it had. One of his own people, an accountant. Ethan had bullied and underpaid for years. A man named Gerald, who had watched the wages get withheld, and the numbers get cooked, and the safety report get buried, had reached his breaking point when the company began to collapse and had gathered everything he'd quietly saved over 2 years and sent it into the light. Not because Catherine told him to, because Catherine had stopped being the wall that kept such men silent and afraid. She had simply let go, and 100 small truths that her presence had held back came flooding through the gap all at once. But Ethan didn't know that. Ethan decided it was Catherine, and that decision, that final catastrophic misreading of the woman he'd never bothered to understand, sent him down the last and darkest road of all. "I have to make some calls," he said. "Ethan," David said, standing, "whatever you're thinking of doing, don't. Please. Right now you're a man who ran a company that had some problems. Problems that a lot of companies have. And if you handle this with any humility at all, you might survive it. You might rebuild. But if you do something reckless, if you go after somebody, if you try to fight instead of taking responsibility, you'll turn a survivable disaster into a permanent one. I've watched you make bad decisions for a year now. I'm begging you, not this one." Ethan looked at him, and for one moment, one flickering moment, the wisdom of it almost reached him. David Chen was a good man, one of the last good men still standing beside him, and everything he said was true. But the pride was louder. It had always been louder. "She thinks she can destroy me and walk away clean," Ethan said. "She thinks nobody will ever know who the chairman really is. Well, I know. I'm the one person on earth who knows. And if she wants a war, then she's going to find out that I don't go down quietly." David Chen closed his eyes. "Then I can't help you anymore, Ethan," he said quietly. "I've stayed longer than I should have. I stayed because I kept hoping the man I first went to work for was still in there somewhere, but he isn't. He hasn't been for a long time. I'm resigning. Effective now. I'm sorry." And David Chen, the last competent, loyal executive at Walker Technologies, gathered his things and walked out, and Ethan let him go because Ethan was already reaching for the phone. What followed was the ugliest 3 weeks of Ethan Walker's life. He hired a public relations firm, an aggressive one, and he began quietly at first, and then not quietly at all, to spread a story. The story was that his company's collapse was not the result of his own choices, but of a coordinated attack by a shadowy financial power, the mysterious Sterling Foundation, which had targeted him for reasons unknown. It was in the narrowest technical sense not entirely false. The foundation had frozen him out. But Ethan told it in a way that left out everything that mattered. He left out the withheld wages. He left out the safety report. He left out the cooked numbers. He told the world he was a victim, a brilliant innovator crushed by a jealous, secretive empire that couldn't stand competition. And for about a week, it almost worked. There is always an appetite for a story about a little guy crushed by a hidden giant, and Ethan told it well. He had always been able to talk his way into anything. Then he made his mistake, the last one. Emboldened by the traction of his victim story, drunk on the feeling of fighting back, Ethan decided to reveal the one card he was certain would change everything. In an interview with a business journalist live on camera, he leaned forward and said the words he thought were a bombshell. "The public deserves to know who's really behind the Sterling Foundation," he said. "The mysterious chairman that nobody's ever identified. Well, I can identify her, because I was married to her. The chairman of the Sterling Foundation, the person controlling over $1 trillion in this country, is a woman named Catherine Bennett Sterling, and she spent 10 years hiding it, living a double life, deceiving everyone around her, including her own husband. That's the kind of person we're dealing with, a woman who lies about who she is." He sat back, certain he'd just detonated something. Certain the world would gasp, would turn on her, would see the secretive puppet master he'd painted. The world did gasp, but not in the direction Ethan expected. Because when the interview aired and the name Catherine Bennett Sterling was finally spoken aloud, and journalists began for the first time to actually dig into who she was, they did not find a shadowy manipulator. They found something else entirely. They found a woman who had inherited one of the largest private fortunes on earth and had spent a decade of her life walking away from all of it to live simply and anonymously, married to an ordinary tech entrepreneur, asking nothing, taking nothing, hiding her wealth so completely that she'd sold her own great-grandmother's necklace rather than reveal it. They found a woman who, it slowly emerged, had quietly directed the Sterling Foundation's charitable arm to fund hospitals and schools and disaster relief for years, all anonymously. They found, in short, not a villain, but a woman of almost unbelievable integrity. And then they found the divorce records and the timeline, and the whole story assembled itself in the public imagination in about 72 hours. And it was not the story Ethan had tried to tell. It was the true one. A man had married a woman he believed was poor. She had supported him for 10 years through poverty and near bankruptcy, sacrificing her own family heirlooms to save his failing company. And then, the moment he became rich and successful, He had thrown her away for a younger, flashier woman, calling his devoted wife a weakness, an embarrassment, someone who didn't fit his image. And only afterward did he discover that the woman he'd discarded was one of the wealthiest people alive, that she'd hidden it out of a beautiful and painful desire to be loved for herself, and that he had failed spectacularly and cruelly, the only test that had ever mattered. Overnight, Ethan Walker became the most hated man in America. The victim story collapsed instantly, and the truth rose up in its place, and it was so much worse for him than any conspiracy. He wasn't the little guy crushed by a giant. He was the ungrateful fool who'd thrown away a devoted wife and $1 trillion because she made him coffee and wore plain dresses. He became a punchline. He became a cautionary tale. Late-night hosts told jokes about him. His name became shorthand on the internet for a certain specific kind of arrogant, blind ingratitude. Strangers recognized him on the street, and they did not look at him with awe anymore. They looked at him with contempt. And the revelation about the safety report, the one at the Rendon facility, the one he'd buried, did the real damage. Because in trying to paint himself as a victim, Ethan had drawn every eye in the country to his company, and the more people looked, the more they found. The regulatory bodies that had received Gerald's package moved from quiet review to formal investigation. Lawyers representing the underpaid workers filed suit. And the shareholders who'd lost fortunes when the true financials came to light filed a suit of their own, a massive one, alleging exactly what the documents proved, that Ethan Walker had knowingly deceived them. Walker Technologies did not survive the month. The board, what was left of it, voted to remove Ethan as CEO. It was not even close. The man who had built the company from a garage was escorted out of its offices by 2 security guards he had personally hired years before, and one of them, an older man named Frank, actually apologized as he did it. "Nothing personal, Mr. Walker," Frank said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "I got kids. I need the job, you understand." And Ethan, who a year ago had been called the future of Silicon Valley, understood perfectly. He understood that he was now a man whom even the security guards pitied. The company was sold off in pieces. Genesis, the great project, the $700 million dream that was supposed to make him a legend, was purchased for a fraction of its worth by a competitor and quietly folded into their operations, stripped of Ethan's name entirely. The technology he'd been so proud of would go on to succeed wildly, just under someone else's banner. And Ethan would spend the rest of his life watching it happen from the outside, knowing it had once been his. He lost the glass house on the hill. The bank took it when he could no longer make the payments, and on the day the movers came, Ethan stood in the empty living room at the marble table where he had once pushed divorce papers across the surface and felt like a king. And he understood at last the perfect and terrible symmetry of his life. He had sat at this table and thrown away a woman who loved him because he thought she was beneath him. And now he was losing everything at the same table alone, and the woman he'd thrown away was more untouchable than the sun. He tried to reach her. Of course he did. Not through lawyers this time, not through the press, but personally, desperately, a dozen phone calls and emails and letters sent to addresses he wasn't even sure were real. Some of them reached the foundation. None of them reached Catherine. She never responded. She never needed to. She had said everything she had to say in the palace, and she was not a woman who repeated herself. Only once did he get an answer, and it did not come from her. It came from Eleanor Voss, the silver-haired woman who served the foundation, in the form of a short, formal email, and it was the last communication Ethan Walker would ever receive from that world. "Mr. Walker," it read, "the chairman has asked me to convey the following, and to make clear that it will be her only response, and that any further attempts at contact will simply go unanswered. She wishes you to know that she bears you no hatred. She wishes you to know that she did not send the documents that ruined you. Your own choices and your own former employees did that when she stopped shielding you from the consequences you had earned. She wishes you to know that she takes no pleasure in your fall, and she wishes you to understand one final thing which she says you may spend the rest of your life considering. She never wanted your empire, Mr. Walker. She never needed your money or your fame or your image. She only ever wanted your loyalty. And that was the one thing, the single thing that you decided was too small to bother keeping. Please do not write again. Sincerely, E. Voss on behalf of the chairman. Ethan read it 100 times, and then he sat in the empty shell of the life he'd destroyed, and for the first time since he was a boy, Ethan Walker put his face in his hands and wept without any pride left at all. He thought about the coffee shop. He thought about a young woman with a book in the corner who'd paid for his drink when his card was declined, who'd looked at him not with pity, but with belief, who'd talked to him for 3 hours about an impossible dream. He thought about a necklace worth $2 million sold in silence so he could make payroll. He thought about 10,000 nights of coffee and quiet loyalty and a love that asked for nothing and gave everything. And he thought about the moment he'd pushed the papers across the table and called it small. I confused silence with weakness, he whispered to the empty room, remembering her words in the palace. I looked at the whole kingdom, and I saw a housewife. I held $1 trillion in my arms every night, and I threw it away because it made me coffee. Victoria Sterling, the woman he'd traded his marriage for, resurfaced exactly once during all of this. Not to help him, to distance herself. She gave a brief statement to a gossip columnist when reporters connected her to the disgraced Ethan Walker, and the statement was a masterpiece of self-preservation. Ethan and I were briefly involved before I understood his true character, she said. I ended things the moment I saw who he really was. My heart goes out to his poor former wife who clearly deserved so much better. I want nothing to do with any of it. Ethan read that too and laughed a hollow, broken laugh because the irony was so complete it was almost artful. Victoria, who had loved his money and fled his poverty, now painting herself as a woman of principle who'd fled his character. She had learned to read the winds even faster than the banks had. And she landed, of course, on her feet, engaged within the year to the hedge fund heir, her name scrubbed clean of Ethan Walker as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. But the deepest cut, the one that Ethan would carry longest, was not the loss of the company or the house or even the public humiliation. It was a smaller thing, a quieter thing. It was the slow dawning understanding of what he'd actually had. Because in the weeks after everything fell as he sat alone in a small rented apartment that looked with cruel precision exactly like the apartment he'd lived in before he ever met Olivia, Ethan finally did the thing she had begged him to do on the night she left. He wondered who she really was. He thought about her honestly, without the filter of his own ego for the first time in 10 years. And what he saw broke him more completely than any bankruptcy. He saw that she had loved him better than he had ever deserved, that every single day of their marriage she had been choosing him quietly over an empire, over a fortune, over the entire glittering world she could have had at the snap of her fingers. She had chosen to fold his towels. She had chosen to make his coffee. She had chosen to sit in the corner at his parties and let people mistake her for an assistant because his ego needed to be the biggest thing in every room, and she had loved him enough to let it. She had spent a decade making herself small so that he could feel large, and he had repaid that impossible self-effacing world-class love by looking at her one night and deciding she was an embarrassment. She was the greatest thing I will ever touch, he said aloud in the small apartment to no one. And I called her a weakness. God forgive me. She was the whole kingdom and I couldn't see past the plain dress. There is a particular kind of ruin that is worse than poverty, worse than shame, worse than the loss of everything a man has built. It is the ruin of a man who finally fully understands what he threw away and understands that it can never, ever be recovered because the fault was never in his circumstances, but in his own soul. That was the ruin Ethan Walker lived in now. He could have borne losing the money. Men lose money. What he could not bear was the knowledge that the woman had been perfect, that the love had been real, that the treasure had been in his hands the entire time, and that he alone, through nothing but his own blindness and pride and ingratitude, had let it go. And 1,000 miles away, in a life he could no longer even imagine, Catherine Bennett Sterling was already turning her enormous power towards something Ethan Walker would never be part of, something larger than his fall, something that would in time touch millions of lives that neither of them had met yet. She had grieved him. She had loved him. And now, finally, she had let him go completely, and she was free in a way she had never been free in all her years of hiding, to become the woman she was always meant to be. Winter came to Austin that year in the strange, mild way it always did, And Ethan Walker learned what it felt like to be forgotten by a city that had once treated him like a prince. The forgetting was not dramatic. That was the part that surprised him most. He had imagined in the early days of the collapse that his fall would be a spectacle, that people would point, that strangers would recognize him and sneer. But that was vanity talking, the last flicker of the ego that had ruined him. The truth was quieter and more humbling than that. The world simply moved on. There was a new genius in the magazines now, a new visionary, a new couple, photographed on a new yacht, and Ethan Walker was already a footnote, a name that made older investors shake their heads and murmur whatever happened to that Walker fellow before the conversation moved to something that mattered. He found that he could walk into a coffee shop now and no one looked at him twice. And there was a strange, bitter poetry in that, because it had been in a coffee shop that his whole life had begun. And it was in coffee shops 10 years later that he finally understood what an ordinary man he had always been underneath the money. The money had made him feel exceptional. Take it away, and he was just a person standing in line waiting for coffee like everyone else. Like she had always been, or so he'd thought. Like she had let him think. One morning in December, sitting alone in exactly such a place, he watched a young man come in. The young man was maybe 25, and he had a laptop with a cracked screen, and he was hunched over it with the particular intensity Ethan recognized instantly, because he had once been that exact person in that exact posture. And then the young man went to the register and his card was declined, and Ethan watched the boy's face flush red, watched him stammer an apology and start to put the pastry back, and something in Ethan's chest cracked wide open. He stood up before he'd decided to. He walked to the register. He told the cashier to put it on his order. The young man turned to him embarrassed and grateful. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Ethan said, and his voice caught because he was hearing another voice from 10 years ago saying those same words. "But you looked like a man having a bad day, and bad days are easier with coffee." The young man laughed, relieved, and thanked him, and asked if he could buy Ethan a coffee sometime to pay him back, and Ethan said that wasn't necessary, and the young man went back to his cracked laptop and his impossible dream. And Ethan sat back down and put his face in his hands and cried silently in the corner of a coffee shop, because he finally understood what she had done for him. He finally understood the size of the kindness he had received and never once repaid. She had bought a stranger a coffee, and then she had spent 10 years buying him a life, and he had thanked her by calling her small. He thought about that young man for days afterward. He wondered what would become of him. He wondered if there was someone in that boy's life who believed in him the way Olivia had believed in Ethan, someone quietly holding him up, and whether the boy would ever know it, and whether he would be wiser with it than Ethan had been. And a strange thing began to happen inside him. For the first time in years, Ethan thought about someone other than himself and found that it eased just slightly the weight in his chest. David Chen noticed the change before Ethan did. They had fallen into a rhythm, the two of them, of sharing a meal every couple of weeks, usually at the cheap kitchen table in Ethan's apartment, sometimes at a diner near David's office. David had taken his new position, and it was going well, and he never lorded it over Ethan, never made him feel the distance that had opened between their circumstances. He just showed up the way real friends show up, and Ethan came to understand that this one loyal man was worth more than every fair-weather friend who had scattered. "You seem different lately," David said one evening over cheap Chinese takeout. "Lighter. I don't know how to describe it. For a while there I was worried about you, Ethan. Really worried. You had that look, the one people get right before they do something they can't come back from." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I thought about it," he admitted. "In the worst of it. I won't pretend I didn't. When everything was gone and Victoria was gone and the friends were gone, and I understood what I'd done to Olivia, there were some nights when I didn't see the point of getting up the next morning." David set down his fork. "Ethan, I'm all right now," Ethan said quickly. "I want you to know that. I got through it. And you were part of how I got through it, David. You showing up, you sitting at this table, I don't think you know what that meant. When you've learned that almost everyone in your life only wanted your money, having one person show up who doesn't want anything, it saves you. It genuinely saves you. So thank you. I don't think I ever said it plainly. Thank you for staying." David looked at him for a long moment, and his eyes were wet. "You covered my accounts when my son was in the hospital," he said. "I never forgot it. Some of us don't." "That was a different man," Ethan said. "No," David said firmly. "It was the same man. It was you. You keep talking about the good version of yourself like he's someone who died. He didn't die, Ethan. He got buried. There's a difference. And I've watched you digging him out for months now, whether you know it or not." Ethan didn't answer, but he thought about the young man in the coffee shop, and he thought maybe David was right. The investigation into Walker Technologies dragged through the winter, and it was in its own grinding way the hardest part. Not because of the fear of prison, though. That fear was real for a while. It was hard because it forced Ethan to sit across tables from investigators and lawyers and account in dry, factual language for every corner he had cut, every truth he had shaded, every worker he had shortchanged. There was no ego left to hide behind. He had to say out loud, into official records, the things he had done. And each admission was a small death, and each one strangely made him feel more human because he was finally taking responsibility for the man he had become, rather than blaming the woman who had stopped saving him from himself. There was one moment late in the process that he would carry with him forever. An investigator, a plain and serious woman who had been methodical and merciless for weeks, closed her folder at the end of a long session and looked at him with something unexpected in her face. "Mr. Walker," she said, "can I ask you something off the record? You don't have to answer." "Go ahead." "Oh, most of the people I investigate, they fight to the last inch. They lie, they deflect, they blame everyone but themselves right up until the moment the cell door closes. You've done the opposite. You've admitted to things I might never have proven. You've handed me a rope over and over that I could have hanged you with. Why? What made you decide to just tell the truth?" Ethan thought about how to answer. "Because someone once told me," he said slowly, "that a man who can't recognize value doesn't get to keep it. And I spent years lying to myself about who I was, and it cost me the only thing that ever mattered. I'm done lying, even to my own detriment, especially to my own detriment. It's the only thing I have left that I can be proud of, that when the truth finally came, I stopped running from it." The investigator studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded and gathered her things, and at the door she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "I've done this for 20 years, and you're the first person I've ever wanted to say this to. I think you might actually come out the other side of this a better man than you went in. Most people don't. Most people just come out poorer. Try not to waste it." And she left. Ethan sat in that room for a long time after she'd gone. The worst practical blow of the winter came in January, when the last of the money truly vanished. There had been, up until then, a small cushion, the remains of accounts that hadn't been leveraged, and Ethan had told himself it made him something more than broke. But the fines came due, and the legal fees came due, and the cushion evaporated, and Ethan found himself at 41 years old, with less money to his name than he'd had in that rented one-bedroom apartment where his whole story began. He had come full circle. Every dollar he'd built, every zero, on every valuation gone as though it had never been. And the man who had once believed the money made him exceptional had to learn in the cold light of January how to be nobody again. But here was the thing that surprised him, the thing he could never have predicted in the arrogant years. Being nobody was survivable. It was even in some strange way a relief. When you have nothing, no one can take anything from you. When you have nothing to protect, you stop being afraid. And Ethan discovered, in the smallest life he had ever lived, a kind of quiet he had not known since before the money came. He slept better on his second-hand mattress than he had in the $12 million house. He ate simple food and tasted it. He walked in the evenings with nowhere in particular to be, and noticed things, the sky, the trees, the faces of ordinary people that he had been too important to notice for a decade. He understood dimly that this was what she had been trying to show him all along, that the plain dresses and the towels and the homemade coffee had never been signs of a small life. They had been a woman who had access to $1 trillion, choosing deliberately the things that actually mattered. She had been rich beyond his imagining, and she had chosen simplicity, chosen him, chosen a quiet life over the glittering emptiness he'd chased straight into ruin. She had known a secret about wealth that he was only now in poverty beginning to learn. And the tragedy of it, the tragedy he would never fully escape, was that she had tried to give him that secret for free every day for 10 years, and he had been too dazzled by the counterfeit to see the real thing in his own kitchen. One night, unable to sleep, he took out the only photograph of her he still had. It was an old one from the early years before the company, before the money. She was laughing at something outside the frame, her head thrown back, her hair loose in front of the little apartment where they'd started. She looked happy, genuinely, completely happy, in a way he realized he had not seen on her face in the final years, and he understood with a fresh stab of grief that he had watched that happiness drain out of her over time, and had been too self-absorbed to notice, too busy becoming important to see the woman beside him becoming sad. "I'm sorry, Liv," he whispered to the photograph. "I'm so sorry. You gave me the best years of your life, and I gave you the worst years of mine, and I didn't even know I was doing it." He didn't send another letter. He'd said everything he had the right to say, but he kept the photograph on the small table by his bed, not as a wound to pick at, but as a reminder of who he wanted to become, because he had decided somewhere in that hard winter that if he could not have her back, and he could not, and if he could not undo what he'd done, and he could not, then the only thing left worth doing was to become at last the man she had believed he could be when she paid for his coffee 10 years ago. Not for her. She was gone, and rightly so, but because it was the only way left to honor what she'd given him, to finally deserve, in retrospect, a love he had failed to deserve in the moment. Spring would come, and with it slowly, the beginning of something that was not redemption exactly, because some things cannot be redeemed, but was perhaps its quieter cousin, the simple, unglamorous work of a broken man learning to be whole. Ethan Walker had lost his company, his fortune, his reputation, and the only woman who had ever truly loved him. He had lost everything a man could lose. And in the losing and the terrible, complete emptying out of everything he had thought made him who he was, he had finally begun, for the first time in his life, to find himself. Spring came, and with it the woman who had once folded towels in an Austin kitchen stepped fully into the light, and the world finally saw what Ethan Walker had thrown away. It began with an announcement that moved through the global financial press like a shockwave. The Sterling Foundation, the most secretive private empire on Earth, the entity that had operated in the shadows for a century, was going public with its purpose. Not going public in the sense of selling shares, it would never do that, but public in the sense that its chairman, whose identity had been one of the great mysteries of high finance, was going to reveal herself and announce a transformation that would touch millions of lives. Catherine Sterling stepped onto a stage in front of the world. The room was filled with the most powerful people alive, the same kind of people who had waited in a gallery in Switzerland for the honor of her attention. And there were cameras, and there was a hush. And then a woman in an elegant but simple gown walked to the podium, and half the financial world learned for the first time the face of the person who had quietly shaped their markets for years. "My name is Catherine Sterling," she said, and her voice was calm and clear and carried to every corner of the room. "For most of my life, almost no one knew that. I chose it that way. I spent years living as an ordinary woman in an ordinary house because I wanted to understand what most of the people in this room have forgotten or perhaps never knew. I wanted to understand what a life is actually worth when you strip away the numbers, and I learned something in those years that I intend to spend the rest of my life acting on." She paused, and the room leaned in. "I learned that wealth is not a scoreboard," she said. "It is a responsibility. For too long, this foundation has moved money for the sake of moving money, has grown for the sake of growing. That ends today. From this day forward, the Sterling Foundation will direct the bulk of its resources toward the things that actually change human lives. Hospitals in places that have never had one. Schools for children the world has written off. Clean energy for communities choking on the old kind. Opportunity, real opportunity for ordinary people with extraordinary dreams, and no one to believe in them." Her voice caught just slightly on those last words, and only one person in the world would have understood why. "Because I know what it means to believe in someone before the world does, and I know how much a single act of belief can change a life. I intend to make that belief my life's work at a scale this world has never seen." The announcement was staggering in its ambition. Over the following months, the plans became real. Ground was broken on hospital after hospital in country after country. Scholarship programs launched that would send hundreds of thousands of children to school. A fund was created, one Catherine oversaw personally dedicated to finding young entrepreneurs, brilliant and broke and overlooked, and giving them exactly the kind of quiet, patient, believing capital she had once given a young man with a broken laptop before that young man forgot who had lifted him. And Catherine Sterling, who had spent 10 years invisible, became almost overnight one of the most admired women on earth. But not for the reason such people were usually admired. Not for the $1 trillion. The world had known there was money at the top of the Sterling Foundation. Money was never rare. What captured people was the story that slowly emerged, the woman who'd had everything and chosen simplicity, the heir who'd folded towels, the queen who'd tested a man not with her fortune, but with the absence of it. And people loved her ordinary people, people in the small towns and the forgotten places, because they understood in her something true. Here at last was someone with unimaginable power who had not forgotten what it was to be small. Here was someone who used $1 trillion not to build monuments to herself, but to lift up the exact kind of people the powerful usually stepped over. Ethan watched it all from his small apartment. He saw the announcement on a television in a diner and had to set down his coffee because his hands were shaking. He saw her face, the face he had shared a bed with for 10 years and never truly known, projected on screens around the world. And he heard her say the words about believing in someone before the world does. And he understood with a private piercing certainty that she was talking about him, about the coffee shop, about what she had given him and what he had done with it. She had taken the worst experience of her life, the betrayal by a man she'd tested and who'd failed, and she had turned it into a mission to do for strangers what she had once done for him. She had taken his failure and transformed it into other people's futures. And he was not bitter. That was the strange and beautiful thing. The old Ethan, the arrogant one, might have been bitter, might have watched her ascension and felt only the sting of what he'd lost. But the man who had wept in a coffee shop over a stranger's declined card felt something else entirely. He felt proud of her, proud in a way he had no right to be, a way that asked for no credit and expected no reward. He watched the woman he had wronged become a force for good in the world on a scale he could barely comprehend, and his chest filled not with envy, but with a fierce, aching gladness that she was at last exactly who she was always meant to be, free of him, free of the disguise, free to pour herself into the world the way she'd always wanted to. "She's magnificent," he said quietly to no one in the diner. The waitress refilling his coffee glanced at the screen. "That Sterling woman, yeah. My sister got into a nursing program through one of her scholarships. Changed her whole life. They say she reads the applications herself, some of them. Can you imagine a woman with all that money sitting up reading letters from nobodies?" She shook her head in wonder and moved on. Ethan sat there and thought, I can imagine. I lived with her for 10 years. She sat up at 2 a.m. reading a nobody's dreams once too. Mine. And I never knew how rare that was until I lost it. He never tried to contact her. He understood that his role in her story was over, that he was a closed chapter, a lesson learned, and that the kindest and most loving thing he could do, the only real gift he had left to give the woman he'd wronged, was to stay out of her light, to let her shine without the shadow of him falling across it. So he watched from a distance, and he cheered for her silently, and he never once reached out, and that silence was in its way the first truly selfless act of his adult life. He loved her enough finally to want nothing from her. Even her happiness, which he was no part of, made him glad. The years passed as years do. Ethan rebuilt slowly, quietly, a small life. The consulting work grew into something modest and honest. He never again touched the world of billion-dollar valuations and magazine covers, and he never wanted to. He'd tasted that world and it had nearly killed his soul. Instead, he did work that was useful and unglamorous, and he was good at it, and the people he worked with came to trust him because the man they knew was steady and humble and told the truth even when it cost him, and none of them knew he had once been Ethan Walker, the visionary, the genius, the cautionary tale. To them, he was just Ethan, a decent man who'd clearly been through something and come out gentler for it. He mended what he could. He found the workers he had shortchanged in the bad years, tracked them down one by one, and though he had little money, he paid back what he could in installments with interest, and more than the money he offered them, the thing he'd never offered anyone in his years of power. A genuine apology face to face with no excuse attached. Some forgave him, some didn't. He accepted both with the same quiet grace because he had learned that you don't apologize to be forgiven. You apologize because it's true. David Chen remained his friend through all of it, the one relationship from the old life that survived precisely because it had never been about money in the first place. David's son grew up, and Ethan was there for the graduation, sitting in the audience beside the man who had stayed when everyone else fled, and when the boy walked across the stage, Ethan clapped until his hands hurt, and understood that this ordinary moment was worth more than any deal he'd ever closed. "You're happy," David observed afterwards, studying his friend's face. "I don't think I ever saw you happy in the old days. Not once. Not really." Ethan considered it. "I wasn't," he said. "I was excited. I was proud. I was important. But I don't think I was ever happy, because happy isn't something you can buy or build or leverage. I had to lose everything to find that out. She tried to tell me. She tried to show me every single day for 10 years. I just couldn't hear it over the sound of my own ambition. Do you ever think about reaching out to her, now that you're, whole again?" Ethan smiled and shook his head. "No, and I'll tell you why. Because reaching out now would just prove her point one last time. She said I'd never be able to prove I wanted her and not her wind under my wings. And she was right. If I showed up now, healed, humble, changed, she'd still never be able to know for sure, and neither would I. The most loving thing I can do for her, the last thing, is to let her go completely. To never take one more thing from her, not even the chance to wonder. She deserves a life with no shadow of me in it. I gave up my right to be in her story the day I called her small. The best I can do now is honor that." David was quiet for a moment. "That might be the wisest thing I've ever heard you say." "I paid an awfully high tuition for it," Ethan said. Across the ocean and across the years, Catherine Sterling built her empire of good. The hospitals opened, the schools filled, the scholarship students graduated and became doctors and teachers and builders and dreamers, and some of them went on to lift others, and the belief she had planted rippled outward in ways no one could count. She was celebrated, honored, awarded, and she accepted it all with the same grace she'd once brought to a plain kitchen, never letting the praise go to her head, because she had seen up close in the person of her ex-husband exactly what praise could do to a soul that wasn't ready for it. She never remarried in haste. She was careful now, careful in the way of someone who had learned the cost of trusting the wrong person, but she did not close her heart entirely, because that too would have been a kind of defeat, a way of letting Ethan's failure win. And in time, years later, she found something real. A man who had no idea who she was when they met a doctor she encountered through the Foundation's work. A man who fell for the warmth of her and the steadiness of her long before he understood the scale of what she controlled. When he did finally learn the truth, he did not weep with the grief her father had wept. He laughed, and he pulled her close, and he said it didn't change a thing because he'd already decided he loved her when he thought she was just a woman who cared too much about strangers' lives. And Catherine at last got the thing she had spent her whole life searching for, the certainty, the love that had chosen her before it ever knew her worth. She built a family. She was surrounded in the end by people who loved her, not for her money, but for her heart, and she was by every measure that actually mattered wealthy beyond imagining. One evening, long after Ethan saw her on television one final time, She was older now, silver threading her hair, and she was opening a new foundation center, and beside her stood a loving husband and children who adored her, and a crowd of people whose lives she had changed, and they looked at her, not with the hungry eyes of people who wanted her money, but with the warm eyes of people who simply loved her. And Ethan, an old man himself now sitting alone in a small and peaceful home, watched her surrounded by all that love, and he wept. Not from grief this time, from something closer to gratitude, because he finally fully understood. He had not lost a billionaire. That was what he'd thought in the first shock of the collapse, that he'd made a catastrophic financial error, that he'd let $1 trillion walk out his door. But that was the old Ethan's accounting, the accounting of a man who measured everything in numbers. The truth was so much larger and so much sadder than money. He had not lost a fortune. He had lost the woman who saw his potential when he had nothing, the woman who paid for his coffee when his card was declined, the woman who sold her grandmother's necklace and let him keep his pride, the woman who sat up with him at 2 a.m. and told him she wasn't going anywhere, the woman who had loved him truly and completely when he was broke and frightened and nobody, and who had asked for nothing in return, but that he not become a man who could no longer recognize what such love was worth. And he had become exactly that man. That was the whole tragedy of his life contained in a single sentence. She had given him the one thing money can't buy, and he had traded it for the one thing money can, and by the time he understood the difference, it was 10 years and a lifetime too late. He turned off the television. He sat in the quiet, and he was not bitter, and he was not broken, not anymore. He was simply a man who had learned the most important lesson a man can learn, and had learned it the hardest way there is. He had spent the first half of his life chasing a queen who matched his success, a Victoria, an image, a mirror for his ego. And all the while the greatest queen he would ever know had been standing right beside him in a plain dress, holding the entire kingdom in her quiet hands, asking only to be loved for herself. He had let her walk away, and she had gone on to change the world. There is a lesson in the story of Ethan Walker and Catherine Sterling, and it is not really about money at all, though it wears the costume of money from beginning to end. The lesson is this: the biggest mistake a person can make is to judge someone by what they show the world. The quietest person in the room, the one in the plain clothes, the one who asks for nothing and serves without being seen, is very often the one holding the entire kingdom in their hands. True wealth was never the number in the bank account. True wealth is the people who stay beside you when you have nothing left, the ones who believe in you before the world does, the ones who love you not for what you can give them, but for who you are. Ethan Walker had all of that once. He held it in his hands and called it small. And he spent the rest of his life understanding that the woman he foolishly let walk away had been from the very first day to the very last the single greatest treasure he would ever be given. He lost her, not because he chose another woman, but because he became a man who could no longer see what was precious. And in the end, that is the only bankruptcy that truly matters. Guard the people who love you when you are nothing, because they, and not the fortune, and not the fame, and not the image, are the real kingdom. And once you lose them, no amount of wealth on earth will ever buy them back. Sit with this story for a moment, because underneath the $1 trillion and the palace in the mountains and the empire that rose and fell, there is something quieter here, something true that has almost nothing to do with money and almost everything to do with the way human beings love one another and the way they throw that love away. Consider first what Ethan Walker actually lost, because he himself misunderstood it for a very long time. In the beginning, when his world collapsed, he believed he had made a financial mistake. He believed he had let a fortune slip through his fingers and that his tragedy was a tragedy of arithmetic. But that was the accounting of a man who still thought in numbers, and it was wrong. Ethan did not lose $1 trillion. $1 trillion is a thing you can lose and survive, because $1 trillion is only ever a tool, a means, a possibility, waiting to be spent. What Ethan lost was something that has no number attached to it at all. He lost the one person who had looked at him when he was nothing and decided he was worth everything. And here is the first hard truth the story offers us. That kind of love, the love that chooses you before you have proven anything, before you have earned anything, before the world has agreed you are worth choosing, is the rarest thing a human life can contain. It comes to most people once, if it comes at all. And it cannot be repurchased at any price, because the very thing that makes it precious is that it was given freely before there was any reason to give it. Think about why Catherine hid who she was. On the surface, it looks like a strange choice, even a cruel one. A woman with unimaginable power pretending to be small. But look closer, and you see, it was not a game. It was the most sincere act of her life. She had watched her own father spend his marriage tormented by a doubt he could never resolve, the doubt of a man who could not be sure whether he had been loved for himself or for what he could offer. And Catherine understood something that most wealthy and powerful people never allow themselves to understand, which is that power poisons the thing it most wants to protect. The more you have to offer, the harder it becomes to know whether you are loved for yourself or for your offering. A crown makes it impossible to know who kneels for you and who kneels for the gold. And so Catherine did the only thing that could give her certainty. She took off the crown, she hid the gold. She stood before the man she wanted to love as a woman with nothing, so that whatever he gave her, he would be giving to her and not to her fortune. This is the second truth of the story, and it is a hard one. Real love can only be measured in the absence of reward. You do not learn whether someone loves you by watching how they treat you when you can give them everything. You learn it by watching how they treat you when you can give them nothing. And this is precisely where Ethan failed, and the nature of his failure is worth understanding exactly, because it is a failure that lives in every human heart, not just his. Ethan did not fail because he was evil. He was not a monster. In the early years, he was by every account a good man, a grateful man, a man who held his wife's hand and meant it when he said he could not have done it without her. His failure was slower and more ordinary and more dangerous than villainy. His failure was that he let his circumstances change who he was. He allowed success to rewrite his values without ever noticing the rewriting was happening. There was no single day when Ethan decided to become a man who would call his wife small. It happened one flattering dinner at a time, one magazine cover at a time, one new important friend at a time, until the accumulated weight of all that praise had quietly replaced the person he used to be with someone who could look at a decade of devotion and see only an image problem. This is the third truth, and perhaps the most frightening one. You are not a fixed thing. Who you are is not safe. Prosperity, comfort, admiration. These are not neutral. They work on the soul the way water works on stone, slowly and visibly. And if you are not paying fierce attention, you can wake up one day to discover you have become a person your younger self would not recognize, and worse, would not respect. Notice, too, the difference between Victoria and Catherine, because the story sets them side by side deliberately, and the contrast is the whole point. Victoria loved what Ethan could give her. She loved the yacht, the magazine covers, the sensation of being seen on the arm of a man the world envied. And because her love was attached to what he could provide, it lasted exactly as long as he could provide it. The moment the money grew frightening, her love evaporated, not because she was uniquely wicked, but because a love built on what a person can give you is not really love at all. It is a transaction wearing love's clothing, and when the terms of the transaction change, it dissolves. Catherine loved Ethan himself, the frightened boy with the broken laptop, and because her love was attached to who he was and not what he had, it survived his poverty, survived his failures, survived years of sacrifice. It only died when he himself killed it. When he became a person she could no longer respect. This is the fourth truth. There are two kinds of love that can look identical from the outside, and you cannot tell them apart in good times, because in good times, they behave the same way. You can only tell them apart in the storm. The love that leaves when things get hard was never love. The love that stays was the real thing all along, and a wise person spends less energy seeking the love that flatters them in their triumph, and more energy recognizing and protecting the love that holds them in their ruin. There is something else here easy to miss about the nature of gratitude. For 10 years, an invisible hand caught Ethan every time he stumbled, and he never knew it. And because he never knew it, he gave himself all the credit. He believed he had climbed alone. And this is a deeply human error, because almost no one climbs alone, and almost everyone believes they did. Every person who has ever succeeded stands on a foundation of help. They have half-forgotten sacrifices made by others that they never fully saw, doors opened by hands they never noticed. The tragedy of Ethan is the tragedy of the ungrateful heart, which mistakes the lift it was given for the strength of its own wings. And the antidote the story quietly suggests is humility, the discipline of remembering that you are held up by others, of looking for the invisible hands and honoring them before they withdraw. Because the cruelest way to learn how much someone was doing for you is to find out only after they stop. And what of Catherine's response, which is the moral heart of the whole story? When she finally had the power to destroy the man who betrayed her, she chose not to. She did not seek revenge. She simply stopped protecting him and let his own choices find him. There is a profound wisdom in this distinction, and it is the fifth truth. There is a difference between destroying someone and ceasing to save them, between pushing a person off a cliff and merely stepping back so they can no longer lean on you. Catherine understood that she did not need to become cruel in order to stop being generous. She did not poison her own soul with vengeance. She let justice arrive on its own, carried by the natural weight of the things Ethan had actually done, and she kept her own hands clean. This is a kind of strength that our world rarely celebrates, the strength to walk away from someone who wronged you without becoming a monster in the process, to let go without lashing out, to refuse both the role of victim and the role of avenger. She was wounded deeply, and she did not let the wound turn her into something small. And in choosing that, she remained the very thing Ethan had wrongly called her, except that the word meant its opposite. She was never small. She was large enough to be betrayed and not become bitter, large enough to have all the power in the world and use it to build hospitals instead of settling scores. And here is the final truth, the one the whole story has been reaching toward from the first word. Ethan spent the first half of his life believing that wealth was something you accumulate, a number that goes up a scoreboard that proves your worth. He learned at catastrophic cost that this is a lie. True wealth was never the number in the account. True wealth was the woman who paid for his coffee, the woman who sat up with him at 2 a.m, the friend who kept showing up at the cheap kitchen table when there was nothing left to gain. True wealth is measured entirely in the people who stay beside you when you have nothing to offer them, because those are the only people whose presence in your life actually means anything. Everyone will stand beside you when you are a king. The whole world will crowd around a man on his way up. The real question, the only question is, who is standing beside you on the day you have lost everything, when there is no yacht, no magazine cover, no fortune, no reason at all to stay except love itself? Those people, and only those people, are your true fortune. And a life spent chasing the other kind of wealth, the visible kind, the kind that fills rooms with admirers who vanish the moment the money does, is a life spent building a mansion on sand. So when you love someone, look closely at what you are actually loving. Are you loving who they are or what they give you? And when someone loves you, watch how they treat you, not on your best day, but on your worst, because that is the only test that tells the truth. Guard fiercely the people who believe in you before the world does, because that belief is a gift you will not be offered twice. And never ever let success change you into someone who can no longer recognize what is precious, because the moment you can no longer see the value of the love in front of you, you have already begun to lose it, no matter how much you own. Ethan Walker held the greatest treasure a human life can hold, and he called it small, and he traded it away, and he spent the rest of his days understanding what he had done. Do not be Ethan Walker. Look at the quiet person beside you, the one in the plain clothes who asks for nothing, and understand that they may be holding the entire kingdom in their hands. And love them truly for who they are while you still can. Because the quietest love is often the deepest, and the deepest love once lost is gone forever, and no fortune ever built can buy back the heart you failed to see.